Welcome back to the Red Dice Diaries, and in this RPG review I'm going to be looking at Archetype, which is a role-playing game created by James Turbrack. James was kind enough to send me a review copy of it, and my review copy, which you can see the cover of here, is approximately 95 pages in length. My immediate thought upon looking at Archetype, with its talk of monsters, its moody cover, and vague yet dissettling opening story about monsters lurking under the bed, was that it reminded me of some of my early World of Darkness purchases. This is by no means a bad comparison. The layout of the book seems fairly minimalist. There are a few pictures scattered about, but by and large the book is black and white 2-column text all the way. It's not impossible to write a good book like this, but let's face it, great art does have a way of really selling a setting and drawing readers in. The book really begins, in my opinion, with a second short story titled The End. It's a nice atmospheric piece told from the perspective of a person undergoing a strange metamorphosis, the ending of one story and the beginning of another. Strangely enough, we then have another short story serving as the lead into the first chapter. I can kind of see what the authors were aiming for, and having fiction jumpstart a chapter is a time-honoured tradition in many RPGs. However, I'm not sure we need 3 single-length stories back-to-back before getting into the actual game. They do follow on from each other, but I think they could have been spread out a bit more throughout the book, maybe a paragraph or two at the start of each chapter, highlighting the concepts presented therein. This is followed by a full page of artwork depicting 3 people who strangely enough put me in the mind of the Walt Disney dwarves, must be the weird hats they're wearing, performing some sort of experiment on a young woman. Potentially a dark and unsettling theme. Unfortunately, the piece is very brightly coloured and doesn't really convey the aspect of menace and darkness that the game seems to be reaching for. Chapter 1 is a competently written chapter explaining the rudiments of role-playing and what will be expected of the GM, called the Arbiter in this game, and the PCs. At this point, the game's first departure from more traditional RPGs becomes apparent. A tarot deck is used as a randomising factor in the place of the more traditional dice. Now, I'm always a bit sceptical when a game uses something like tarot cards. There have been games that have done so to great effect, but unless the system makes use of them beyond something like as a random number generator, I've generally not seen the point of using anything besides dice, except for the novelty factor, of course. Hopefully Archetype will have something more in store for the tarot deck. There is a nice list of terms and definitions in the chapter, which is a very good thing in my opinion. It's always useful to define terms before they start being used in a book. It's also useful as a reference to have them all in one place. Chapter 2 is character creation, and it begins with a full-page piece of art showing 2 figures, one paladin-like and the other distinctly chaotic and evil-looking. Oddly, though, the picture is in landscape format, whereas the rest of the book is portrait, which means that you'd have to turn your book sideways to look at it properly, and to be honest, that just seems a little odd. Player characters in the game work for an organisation known as Archetype, a shadowy organisation created to fight against monsters and things that go bump in the night, even going so far as to infuse their warriors with the energy of the self-same creatures they fight. This is a very interesting idea, and the author offers numerous suggestions how the size and scope of the organisation could be tweaked to fit your particular game. I must confess that I found the character quick start in this section a little bit bewildering. We start with standard allocation of points between physical, social and mental attributes. However, the player then allocates ranks to paths of study corresponding to a tarot suit and picks an attribute keyword for each path they have ranks in. For example, the suit of cups has its options as appearance, esteem and wisdom. There are a few other ability types that the player has to pick, including skills, equipment, inhuman keywords. However, in my opinion, the writing of the quick start isn't very clear, which is fairly essential as far as I'm concerned for a section that should allow you to write a character quickly with minimum fuss. Unless you had some existing familiarity with the game, I don't really see you being able to make much use of this quick start, to be honest. For example, you're told to choose skills and place ranks equal to the derived attribute aptitude, but nowhere in the quick start appears to tell you what skills are derived from which attribute. This is covered later in the chapter, but having to look stuff like this up seems to defeat the purpose of a quick start, especially when it could have so easily been remedied by putting the associated attribute next to the skills in question in brackets or in a heading, as many other games do. A serviceable list of equipment follows, and then we move on to attuning. Attuning is the magical powers that your character gets from their monstrous side, this monstrous energy, if you will, and is effectively a large list of keyworded spells that the character gets to choose from to represent the innate powers their attunement has given them. There is a broad range of different spells that all have multiple effects, depending on how much willpower the PCs want to pump into them, covering things from speaking any known language to drawing the very essence from opponents to power further enchantments. Character growth is also discussed in this chapter, the author adopting the interesting idea that characters advance very slowly in terms of raw abilities, but in order to satisfy the player's craving for advancement, the organisation Archetype can empower the PCs for successfully completing missions. I'm not sure how this would work in an actual game, but it's certainly an inventive attempt to address some commonly raised issues with the standard experience point model used by many RPGs. Chapter 3 is Game Mechanics, and it has a fairly standard start for an RPG, covering how the game is broken down into scenes and into rounds. In order to attempt a task, a player draws a number of cards and compares the face value of each draw to a difficulty level. If any of the cards are equal or higher to the difficulty number, then they succeed. The more success is gained, the more spectacularly they have succeeded. The number of cards drawn is determined by the ranks a PC has in the applicable skill. This seems like a reasonable method of resolving challenges. It's effectively a dice pool mechanic where the dice are substituted for a random card draw. Perfectly serviceable. As an additional wrinkle, for every keyword a character has beyond one, they may redraw one card each hand. Also, anyone drawing the 14 of cups gets to draw an additional card and add that card's total to the face value of any other single card in their draw. We then move on to combat. All physical attacks have a multiplier and a modifier. The number of successes you gain for your attack are multiplied by the multiplier, and then you add the modifier to get the initial damage inflicted. It's starting to become obvious by this point that this book is squarely aimed at people who like a little bit more crunch in their RPGs, and that's absolutely fine if you like that sort of thing. Magic occurs by drawing a number of major arcana cards and then playing cards that have a face value equal to or greater than the casting difficulty of the spell in question. Characters who take damage and lose health gradually find their card hand size dwindling until they find some means of healing. It's an interesting idea to represent exhaustion and wound penalties using the card hand, although by this stage, to be honest, I was starting to question the amount of stuff that the GMs and the PCs would have to keep track of. I don't think it's impossible by any means, and those who love a crunchier game would probably lap it up, but to me it just seems a little bit unnecessary. Chapter 4 is a bestiary chapter containing monster stats. Each monster gets a page, but oddly enough there is a dearth of any real artwork in this chapter, other than one or two pieces. And not much information is offered about the ecology of the creatures, other than a brief 2 or 3 sentence description, the rest of the page being given entirely over to stats. Some brief information on balancing an encounter follows, and then we move on to a couple of uncluttered and functional sheets. And that's pretty much where my PDF copy ended. It just seemed to break off, and there didn't even seem to be a back cover attached to the PDF. At least one wasn't present in the PDF version I was sent. So, in conclusion, I'm a little bit conflicted about Archetype, to be honest. There were some interesting ideas in it. I like the idea of an organisation making monsters of their people as a desperate measure to protect people against the real monsters out there. However, it did feel very much to me that the end result is a D&D style character with a load of spells that they can use when they like. The game on a whole to me felt like a mishmash of World of Darkness with a D&D game, since allegedly the game takes place in a fantasy world, although there didn't really seem to be any information in the book about the setting at all. My impression of the game was very much of an RPG that perhaps began as something else or a home-brewed system and was heavily house-rolled and transformed into something new, but it doesn't really feel finished. So, in conclusion, I would say that first of all, the The negative aspects of this game, as far as I am concerned, are that it has an unnecessarily confusing system. The layout of the book is not particularly pleasing to the eye. There's a lack of detail about the game setting and the creatures that inhabit it, and overall the game doesn't really feel finished to me. However, the positives of the system is that there's some really beautiful artwork in it, although it is very scarce, and the concept of the game is very interesting indeed. It could have just done with being followed through on a little bit more. So, in conclusion, I would say that whilst the game has some interesting concepts, it doesn't really present a coherent campaign or world, and is far from cheap at £11.60 in British money. If you're looking for a project that may require some house rolling and the GM to do a fair bit of work to polish off the rough edges on the system, and you don't mind a bit of a crunchier rules system, then you may find something of interest in Archetype. So, I hope if you've enjoyed this review, you'll consider clicking on the red dice up there to subscribe to my channel. You can find us all on all the normal social media by looking at the links over there. If you have any comments, please either leave them down below or, as always, hit me up in the Google Plus links. Until I see you next time, take care and happy gaming.